Sarah Mitchell had never imagined she would find herself on a dusty military transport plane, clutching a worn photograph of her husband David. The engines roared beneath her as the aircraft descended toward Forward Operating Base Phoenix, somewhere in the remote mountains of Afghanistan. Her hands trembled slightly, not from the turbulence, but from the mix of excitement and anxiety that had been building for weeks since she learned about the military's special family visit program. The journey had started 3 months earlier when David's commanding officer, Colonel Henderson, had called their home in Colorado Springs. Sarah remembered dropping the phone when he explained that David had been selected for an extended deployment, but there was a chance for family members to visit the base under strict security protocols. It was rare, almost unheard of, but David's exceptional service record and the relative stability of their sector had made it possible. David Mitchell was a sniper with the 75th Ranger Regiment, a quiet man who spoke more with his eyes than his words. They had met at a coffee shop near Fort Carson 5 years ago, when Sarah was working as a nurse at the local hospital. She had been drawn to his calm presence, the way he listened more than he spoke, and how his rare smile seemed to light up his entire face. Their courtship had been gentle and steady, like everything about David. The base materialized below them as the transport circled for landing. Sarah pressed her face to the small window, trying to catch a glimpse of the place that had been David's home for the past 8 months. The landscape was harsh and beautiful in its own way, with jagged mountains rising like ancient sentinels around a valley dotted with military structures. The base itself looked like a small city, with rows of buildings, vehicle parks, and defensive positions carved into the rocky terrain. As the plane touched down with a jarring thud, Sarah's heart raced. She hadn't seen David since his deployment began, communicating only through occasional video calls that were often interrupted by poor connections or operational requirements. The photograph in her hand showed him in his dress uniform from their wedding day, his serious expression softened by love and hope for their future together. The cargo door opened with a hydraulic whine, and desert heat rushed in like an oven blast. Sarah gathered her small bag and followed the other passengers down the ramp. The air was thin at this altitude, and she took shallow breaths as her eyes adjusted to the brilliant sunlight. The sound of helicopters and diesel engines filled the air, mixed with the voices of soldiers going about their duties. A young sergeant approached her with a clipboard and a professional smile. "Mrs. Mitchell, I'm Sergeant Rodriguez. Welcome to FOB Phoenix. I'll be escorting you to the visitor quarters and briefing you on base protocols." As they walked across the tarmac, Sarah noticed the constant activity around them. Soldiers moved with purpose, some heading to vehicles, others carrying equipment or heading to various buildings. The atmosphere was businesslike, but not tense, suggesting that this was indeed one of the more stable areas of operations. The visitor quarters were modest but clean, consisting of a small room with a cot, a desk, and basic amenities. Sergeant Rodriguez explained the rules. Sarah would stay for 5 days, meals would be provided in the main dining facility, and she could meet with David during his off-duty hours. She was not permitted to leave the base perimeter, and all communications home would be monitored for security reasons. "Your husband is currently out on patrol," Rodriguez explained, checking his watch. "They're expected back around 1800 hours. Colonel Henderson would like to meet with you at 1600 to discuss the schedule and answer any questions." Left alone in her quarters, Sarah unpacked her few belongings and tried to process the surreal nature of her situation. Through the small window, she could see soldiers training in the distance, their movements precise and coordinated. The constant background noise of military operations was unlike anything she had experienced, a reminder that this was an active combat zone despite the current calm. The meeting with Colonel Henderson took place in his office, a functional space decorated only with maps, unit photos, and operational charts. Henderson was a career soldier in his 40s, with graying hair and eyes that had seen too much but still held warmth when he spoke about his troops. "Mrs. Mitchell, I want you to understand how exceptional this visit is," Henderson began, pouring coffee from a thermal carafe. "Your husband is one of our finest soldiers, and his work here has been invaluable. He's saved countless lives with his precision and professionalism." Sarah felt a surge of pride mixed with worry. She knew David was skilled at his job, but Hearing it from his commanding officer made the reality of his dangerous work more concrete. How is he doing? I mean, really doing? Henderson considered his words carefully. David is handling the deployment well. He's respected by his teammates and has adapted to the challenges here. But I won't lie to you, this kind of work takes a toll. Having you here will mean more to him than you might realize. The conversation continued with Henderson explaining the base's mission and current situation. They were tasked with training local security forces and conducting precision operations against insurgent networks in the region. The area had been relatively quiet for several months, but everyone remained vigilant. As evening approached, Sarah found herself growing more nervous about seeing David. Would he be different? Would the months of combat and separation have changed him? She had changed too, spending lonely nights wondering about his safety and learning to manage their household affairs alone. At precisely 1800 hours, she heard vehicles approaching the base. From her window, she watched as a convoy of armored trucks rolled through the main gate, dust clouds trailing behind them. Her heart pounded as she realized David was in one of those vehicles, finally, within reach after months of separation. A knock on her door came 20 minutes later. She opened it to find David standing there in his combat gear, dust on his face and exhaustion in his eyes. For a moment, they just stared at each other, as if neither could quite believe the other was real. "Sarah," he said softly, his voice exactly as she remembered, but somehow more precious after the long silence. She stepped forward and wrapped her arms around him, feeling the solid reality of his presence, smelling the mixture of dust, sweat, and the familiar scent that was uniquely his. He held her tightly, and she could feel some of the tension leave his body. "I can't believe you're here," he whispered into her hair. "I keep thinking I'm going to wake up." They spent the evening in the dining facility, sharing a simple meal while catching up on months of separation. David told her about his team, the soldiers he worked with, and the landscape he had come to know intimately through his scope. Sarah shared news from home, updates about their families and friends, and the small details of daily life that had seemed mundane but now felt precious. Later, as they walked around the base perimeter in the cooling evening air, David pointed out various landmarks and explained the base's layout. His knowledge of every position, every angle, and every potential threat was impressive and slightly unsettling. This was his world now, measured in ranges and sight lines, where every shadow could hide danger. "Do you like it here?" Sarah asked, immediately regretting the simplicity of the question. David was quiet for a long moment, watching the mountains fade into purple silhouettes against the darkening sky. "It's not about liking it," he finally said. "It's about doing what needs to be done. But having you here, it reminds me why I'm doing it." That first night, they lay together on the narrow cot, fully clothed and simply holding each other. Sarah listened to David's breathing gradually slow and deepen as he fell into what seemed like the first peaceful sleep he had experienced in months. She stayed awake longer, processing the reality of where she was and marveling at the strange circumstances that had brought them together in this remote corner of the world. The next morning brought a routine that was both military precise and surprisingly normal. David had duties to attend to, but the base commander had arranged for him to have modified schedules during Sarah's visit. They breakfasted together in the dining facility, surrounded by soldiers who nodded respectfully to Sarah and seemed genuinely happy to meet David's wife. Sarah spent her days exploring the parts of the base she was permitted to access, reading books she had brought, and writing in a journal about her experiences. The soldiers she encountered were uniformly polite and professional, many sharing brief stories about their own families or asking about life back home. She began to understand the tight-knit community that had formed in this isolated outpost. David's work as a sniper meant he often spent long hours in observation positions or on patrol. Sarah learned not to ask too many questions about the specifics of his missions, understanding that some things were better left unspoken. Instead, they focused on the present moments they had together, sharing meals, walking in the evenings, and simply enjoying each other's company. On the third day of her visit, Sarah accompanied David to the base's small chapel for a service led by the military chaplain. The simple ceremony, attended by soldiers from various units, reminded her of the faith that had always been important to both of them. David seemed more relaxed in this setting, his guard down in a way she rarely saw elsewhere on the base. After the service, they met some of David's teammates from his sniper unit. Sergeant Mike Torres, David's spotter, was a young man from Texas with an easy smile and obvious respect for David's skills. Corporal Jennifer Walsh was a communications specialist who had become part of their tight-knit group, and Staff Sergeant Ray Coleman was a veteran sniper who served as an unofficial mentor to the younger soldiers. "Dave talks about you all the time," Torres told Sarah with a grin. "Most boring patrol conversations ever. Sarah does this, Sarah says that. We were starting to think you were imaginary." The easy camaraderie between the team members was evident, and Sarah could see how David had found a second family among these soldiers. They looked out for each other with an intensity born of shared danger and mutual dependence. It was clear that David's role in the team was not just about his shooting skills, but about his steady presence and reliable judgment. As her visit progressed, Sarah noticed changes in David that both worried and impressed her. He was more alert to his surroundings, constantly scanning for potential threats even in the relative safety of the base. His movements were more deliberate and economical, wasting no energy or motion. There was a hardness in his eyes that hadn't been there before, but also a depth of experience and confidence. The fourth evening of her visit, they sat together on a small observation deck attached to the visitor quarters, watching the sunset paint the mountains in brilliant colors. David had been quieter than usual, and Sarah sensed he was struggling with something. "What happens when you go home?" she asked gently. David took a long time to answer. "I don't know," he admitted. "This place, that changes you. I'm not sure I'll be the same person who left Colorado Springs." Sarah took his hand, feeling the calluses from months of handling weapons and equipment. "I don't need you to be the same person," she said. "I just need you to come home." They talked late into the night about their fears and hopes for the future. David worried about readjusting to civilian life, about whether he would be able to leave the hypervigilance and constant awareness behind. Sarah shared her own struggles with the loneliness and uncertainty of military spouse life, the way she had learned to live with the constant background worry about his safety. The conversation deepened their connection in ways that months of brief phone calls had not been able to achieve. They made plans for David's eventual return, talked about the possibility of starting a family, and discussed how they would navigate the challenges of reintegration together. On her final morning at the base, Sarah woke to find David already dressed and preparing for what she sensed was an important mission. His teammates were gathering their equipment with unusual intensity, and there was a tension in the air that hadn't been present during the previous days. "We have to move out early today," David explained, strapping on his gear with practiced efficiency. "Intelligence came in overnight about enemy movement in our sector. It should be routine, but—" He didn't finish the sentence, but Sarah understood. Nothing was ever truly routine in this environment, and today felt different somehow. She helped him check his equipment, a ritual that felt both intimate and ominous. His rifle, cleaned and maintained with obsessive care, seemed to represent everything that separated their worlds. As the team prepared to depart, Sarah stood with the other soldiers who were remaining on base, watching the convoy form up near the main gate. David found her in the small crowd and gave her a long, intense look that seemed to memorize her face. They couldn't embrace or show affection in front of the assembled troops, but the connection between them was unmistakable. "I'll see you tonight," he said simply, but his eyes said much more. The convoy rolled out in a cloud of dust and diesel exhaust, leaving Sarah with an empty feeling in her stomach and the sudden realization that her safe, temporary insertion into David's world was about to become something much more complex and dangerous. The quiet morning routine of the base continued around her, but everything felt different now, charged with potential and threat. Standing alone in the courtyard, watching the dust settle, Sarah had no way of knowing that the events of this day would change everything. For David, for their marriage, and for her own understanding of what it meant to be connected to someone whose job required him to make life and death decisions in split seconds. The visit that was supposed to bring them closer together was about to test their relationship in ways neither of them could have imagined. The morning sun had barely cleared the mountain peaks when the convoy carrying David and his sniper team disappeared into the winding valleys beyond forward operating base Phoenix. Sarah spent the early hours trying to distract herself with mundane activities, but The knot of anxiety in her stomach grew tighter with each passing hour. She had experienced worry during David's deployment, but being physically present at the base while he was out on a mission created an entirely different level of tension. By midday, the heat had become oppressive, and most non-essential personnel had retreated to air-conditioned buildings. Sarah found herself in the base library, a small room stocked with donated books, magazines, and a few computers for soldiers to use during their downtime. She attempted to read, but her eyes kept drifting to the clock on the wall and the radio that occasionally crackled with routine communications. Sergeant Rodriguez found her there around 1,400 hours, his expression more serious than she had seen before. "Mrs. Mitchell, Colonel Henderson would like to see you in his office when you have a moment." The walk across the base felt longer than usual, and Sarah noticed that the normal activity level seemed subdued. Soldiers moved with purpose but spoke in quieter tones, and there was an undercurrent of tension that hadn't been present during her previous days on the base. Colonel Henderson was studying a large map when she entered his office, red and blue pins marking various positions across the terrain. He looked up with a reassuring smile, but Sarah could see the concern in his eyes. "Sarah, please sit down. I wanted to update you on your husband's mission status." Henderson poured coffee from his ever-present thermal carafe, his movements deliberate and calming. "The team reached their observation position on schedule and has been providing overwatch for a patrol from our Afghan National Army partners. Everything is proceeding according to plan." Despite his reassuring words, Sarah sensed there was more to the story. "But," she prompted. Henderson set down his cup and leaned back in his chair. "We've had reports of increased insurgent activity in the region over the past 48 hours. Nothing that directly threatens your husband's team, but we're monitoring the situation closely. I wanted you to know so you wouldn't be surprised if their return is delayed." The afternoon dragged by with agonizing slowness. Sarah tried to maintain her normal routine, eating lunch in the dining facility and taking a walk around the permitted areas of the base, but every conversation seemed to stop when she approached, and every glance from the soldiers felt loaded with unspoken information. Around 1,600 hours, the first sign of trouble came in the form of increased radio chatter. Sarah couldn't understand the military jargon and code words, but the urgency in the voices was unmistakable. She was sitting in the visitor quarters when she heard helicopters spinning up in the distance, their rotors beating the air with increasing intensity. A knock on her door revealed Sergeant Rodriguez again, this time accompanied by a medic she hadn't met before. "Mrs. Mitchell, we're going to ask you to stay in your quarters for the next few hours. There's been an incident in the field, and we need to maintain clear communications." "What kind of incident?" Sarah asked, her voice steadier than she felt. "Is David okay?" Rodriguez exchanged a glance with the medic before answering. "We don't have complete information yet, ma'am. As soon as we know more, Colonel Henderson will brief you personally." Left alone, Sarah paced the small room like a caged animal. Through her window, she could see the controlled chaos of a military base responding to a crisis. Vehicles moved quickly between buildings, soldiers ran with equipment, and the helicopters that had been spooling up were now lifting off in formation, heading in the direction David's team had taken that morning. The waiting was torture. Every sound outside her door made her hope for news, but hours passed with only the distant noise of ongoing operations. She tried calling David's satellite phone, but the call wouldn't connect. She attempted to reach Colonel Henderson's office, but was told he was unavailable. As darkness fell over the base, Sarah's imagination began creating scenarios that were probably worse than the reality. But she couldn't stop herself from thinking about IEDs, ambushes, and all the dangers that lurked in the mountains beyond the base perimeter. She had known intellectually that David faced these risks every day, but experiencing the uncertainty firsthand was overwhelming. At 2,130 hours, Colonel Henderson finally arrived at her quarters, accompanied by the base chaplain and a senior medical officer. The presence of the chaplain made Sarah's heart skip, and she prepared herself for the worst possible news. "Sarah," Henderson began, settling into the room's single chair while the others remained standing. "Your husband's team was engaged by insurgent forces earlier today. The situation is ongoing, but I can tell you that David is alive and uninjured as of our last communication." Relief flooded through her, followed immediately by a dozen questions. What happened? Where are they? When will they be back? Henderson held up a hand to slow her questions. Here's what we know. David's team was providing overwatch for an Afghan National Army patrol when they came under coordinated attack from multiple positions. The enemy force was larger and better organized than our intelligence had indicated. The patrol took casualties and was pinned down in a valley about 12 kilometers from here. The colonel paused to check his notes before continuing. Your husband's precision fire was instrumental in breaking up the initial assault and allowing the patrol to reach a more defensible position. However, the enemy has them surrounded, and we're coordinating a complex operation to extract both the ANA patrol and our sniper team. Sarah tried to process the information, but the military terminology and tactical situation were beyond her civilian understanding. So they're trapped. They're in a defensible position with adequate supplies and ammunition, the chaplain interjected gently. The enemy doesn't have the capability to overrun their position, but our forces can't safely extract them until we neutralize the surrounding threats. The medical officer, a major named Thompson, stepped forward with a more detailed explanation. Mrs. Mitchell, your husband, and his team are trained for exactly this type of situation. They have supplies for several days, secure communications, and air support is being coordinated. The biggest challenge is the terrain. The valley where they're located makes helicopter extraction dangerous until we can clear the enemy positions on the surrounding ridges. Henderson spread a map on the small desk, pointing to various marked positions. This is where the team is located. He indicated a circled area in a narrow valley. The enemy has positions here, here, and here. He pointed to several red marks on the ridgelines. We're bringing in additional assets to systematically clear each position, but it's going to take time to do it safely. As the briefing continued, Sarah began to understand the complexity of the tactical situation. David and his teammates were not in immediate danger, but they were effectively trapped until a larger military operation could clear the enemy forces that had them surrounded. The operation would involve multiple units, helicopter gunships, and careful coordination to avoid friendly fire incidents. How long could this take? Sarah asked, trying to keep her voice steady. 12 to 18 hours for the clearing operation, Henderson replied. Maybe longer if the weather turns bad, or if the enemy proves more capable than we expect. The officials left Sarah with promises of regular updates, and the assurance that everything possible was being done to bring David and his team home safely. But, alone in her quarters, she felt more helpless than she had ever experienced in her life. At home in Colorado Springs, she could at least maintain the illusion that her daily activities and normal routine provided some form of control. Here, surrounded by the machinery of war, she was forced to confront the reality that David's survival depended entirely on factors beyond anyone's complete control. Sleep was impossible. Sarah sat by her window, watching the ongoing activity on the base as the rescue operation continued through the night. Helicopters came and went at irregular intervals, their searchlights sweeping the darkness as they headed toward or returned from the mountains. Ground vehicles moved in convoys, carrying additional troops and equipment to support the operation. Around 0300 hours, she heard explosions in the distance, dim rumbles that seemed to come from the direction where David's team was located. The sounds were followed by periods of silence, then more explosions. She had no way of knowing whether the sounds represented progress in the rescue operation or increased danger for the trapped soldiers. At dawn, Sergeant Rodriguez brought her breakfast and a brief update. The clearing operation is progressing on schedule, he reported. 2 of the enemy positions have been neutralized, and the 3rd is under assault now. Your husband's team continues to provide supporting fire and intelligence. The news was encouraging, but Sarah remained on edge. She had learned enough about military operations during her time on the base to know that plans could change rapidly, and that success was never guaranteed until everyone was safely back. Throughout the morning, she could hear increased helicopter traffic and the distant sound of explosions. The base's operations center was clearly running at maximum capacity, with personnel moving urgently between buildings and communications equipment operating continuously. Around midday, the activity level on the base suddenly shifted. Instead of the controlled urgency she had observed for the past 18 hours, There was a sense of relief and accomplishment in the movements of the soldiers she could see from her window. Vehicles began returning from the direction of the mountains, and the constant helicopter traffic slowed to occasional flights. Colonel Henderson arrived at her quarters at 1,245 hours, and for the first time since the crisis began, he was smiling. "Sarah, I have good news. The clearing operation was successful, and all friendly forces have been extracted from the valley. Your husband and his team are currently inbound to the base and should arrive within the hour." The relief was so intense that Sarah felt lightheaded. "Are they okay?" "All of them. David is uninjured, as are the other members of his team," Henderson confirmed. "They're tired and probably hungry, but they're coming home safe." The Afghan National Army Patrol also made it out with minimal casualties, thanks in large part to your husband's precision shooting during the initial engagement. As Henderson left to attend to other duties, Sarah realized that she was crying, tears of relief, gratitude, and a dozen other emotions she couldn't identify. The past day had given her a glimpse into the reality of David's world that no amount of explanation could have provided. She had experienced, in a small way, the uncertainty and fear that were constant companions for military families around the world. When the convoy carrying David's team finally rolled through the base gates, Sarah was waiting in the designated area along with family members and friends of the other soldiers. The vehicles looked different than they had when departing the previous morning, dustier, more battered, with visible signs of the engagement they had survived. David emerged from the lead vehicle looking exhausted but alert, his gear dirty and his face marked by fatigue and stress. When he saw Sarah waiting for him, his expression transformed from the hardened focus of a soldier to the vulnerability of a husband who had spent 18 hours wondering if he would ever see his wife again. They embraced without words, both understanding that something fundamental had changed during the past day. Sarah had experienced the reality of David's world in a way that went far beyond intellectual understanding, and David had been reminded of what he had to lose and why his survival mattered so much. "I heard you were the hero of the day," Sarah whispered as they held each other. David pulled back to look at her, his eyes serious. "There are no heroes out there," he said quietly. "Just people doing their jobs and trying to get everyone home safe. The debriefing and equipment maintenance would come later. For now, they simply held each other while the sun set over the mountains that had nearly claimed David's life, both of them forever changed by their shared experience of what it meant to live and love in a world where danger was always just beyond the horizon." The morning after David's return from the 18-hour ordeal in the valley, Sarah woke to find him sitting at the small desk in their quarters, meticulously cleaning his rifle with the same careful attention he had always given the weapon, but with an intensity that seemed different. His movements were precise and methodical, but there was something in his posture that suggested the events of the previous day had affected him more deeply than he was willing to admit. "Did you sleep at all?" Sarah asked softly, not wanting to startle him. David looked up from the rifle's bolt assembly, his eyes showing the fatigue of someone who had been awake for nearly 36 hours. "A little. Kept hearing things that weren't there." He resumed cleaning, each motion deliberate and practiced. "The team did good work yesterday. Everyone came home." Sarah recognized the deflection, but chose not to push. She had learned during their marriage that David processed difficult experiences internally before he was ready to share them. Instead, she dressed quietly and prepared for what she knew would be her final full day at Forward Operating Base Phoenix. Over breakfast in the dining facility, several soldiers approached their table to congratulate David on the previous day's mission. The details of what had actually happened were still unclear to Sarah, but it was obvious that David's role had been significant. Staff Sergeant Coleman, the veteran sniper who mentored the younger soldiers, sat down with them and provided some context. "What Dave did yesterday probably saved a dozen lives," Coleman said quietly, cutting his eggs with military precision. "The A&A patrol was caught in a killing field, completely exposed, when the shooting started. Dave's first shot took out the enemy machine gunner who had them pinned down. Without that, they never would have made it to cover." David shifted uncomfortably at the praise. "Torres was feeding me perfect range and wind data. Walsh kept communications open with the patrol. It was a team effort." Coleman smiled knowingly. "You can be modest all you want, but that was a hell of a shot under pressure." 800 meters, uphill angle, with people's lives hanging in the balance. Not many shooters could have made it. As the day progressed, Sarah began to piece together more details about the engagement from conversations with other soldiers and staff. The enemy force had been larger and better coordinated than initial intelligence had suggested, with at least 30 fighters positioned on multiple ridgelines around the valley. The attack had been carefully planned to catch the Afghan patrol in a crossfire with no easy escape routes. David's sniper team had been positioned on an overlook nearly a kilometer away, tasked with providing overwatch and intelligence for the patrol. When the shooting started, David had immediately identified the primary threats and begun engaging targets that posed the greatest danger to the trapped soldiers. His precision shooting had disrupted the enemy's plan and created opportunities for the patrol to reach defensive positions. But, as Sarah learned more about the engagement, she also began to understand the weight that David was carrying. Each shot he had fired had ended a human life, and while those shots had saved friendly forces, the psychological impact of taking multiple lives in a single engagement was something that couldn't be easily dismissed or forgotten. During lunch, Sergeant Torres approached their table with a serious expression. "Dave, Colonel Henderson wants to see the team at 1,400 hours. Something about after-action reports and recommendations." David nodded, but Sarah could see the tension in his shoulders increase. Military debriefings were standard procedure after any engagement, but she sensed that this meeting might be different. After David left for the debriefing, Sarah found herself alone with her thoughts and the growing realization that her visit to the base had coincided with events that would fundamentally change David's military service. She walked to the small chapel, seeking some quiet space to process her own emotions about what had happened. The chaplain, Captain Morris, was arranging chairs when she entered. He looked up with a warm smile and invited her to sit in one of the front pews. "How are you holding up, Sarah? Yesterday was difficult for everyone, but especially challenging for the families." Sarah considered the question carefully. "I think I'm beginning to understand what David goes through out here. I mean, I thought I understood before, but experiencing it firsthand, it's different." Captain Morris nodded thoughtfully. "Military spouses often tell me that. There's a difference between knowing intellectually that your partner faces danger and actually feeling that uncertainty yourself. What you experienced yesterday, that waiting, that fear, that helplessness, that's what David lives with every time he thinks about you back home." The conversation helped Sarah put her experience in perspective, but it also raised questions about how this deployment was affecting David psychologically. She had noticed changes in him during her visit. Increased alertness, a tendency to scan his surroundings constantly, moments when he seemed to withdraw into himself. Yesterday's engagement had probably intensified these changes. When David returned from his debriefing 3 hours later, his expression was carefully neutral, but Sarah could tell something significant had happened. He sat heavily on the narrow cot and stared at his hands for a long moment before speaking. "Colonel Henderson is recommending me for the Bronze Star with Valor device," he said quietly, "for actions during yesterday's engagement." Sarah felt a surge of pride, but David's tone suggested he had mixed feelings about the recognition. "That's wonderful, David. You save lives." "Maybe." He looked up at her with eyes that seemed older than they had been a week ago. "The citation will read that way, but all I was doing was my job. Point and shoot. Calculate range and wind. Squeeze the trigger. The same thing I've done hundreds of times in training." Sarah moved to sit beside him on the cot. "But this time it mattered. Real people lived because of what you did." David was quiet for a long time, and when he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I killed 6 people yesterday, Sarah. 6 human beings who woke up that morning thinking they were going to go home to their families too. I know they were trying to kill our guys. I know what I did was necessary, but that doesn't make it easy to live with." This was the conversation Sarah had been both dreading and hoping for since David's return. She knew that her husband was struggling with the moral complexity of his actions, even though those actions had been both necessary and heroic by any reasonable measure. "Do you regret what you did?" she asked carefully. David shook his head immediately. "No. If I had to do it again, I would make the same choices. Those A&A soldiers have families too, and they deserve to go home safely. But that doesn't mean it doesn't affect me." They talked for hours about the psychological burden of taking lives, even in combat, even when necessary to save others. David described the moment-by-moment decisions he had made during the engagement, the way training and instinct had taken over, and the strange clarity that had allowed him to function under extreme pressure. The weird thing is how normal it felt in the moment, he explained. All the noise and chaos around me. But when I was behind the scope, everything was quiet and clear. Range to target, wind conditions, lead for movement. It was just math and physics. It wasn't until afterward, when I had time to think about it, that the human cost hit me. Sarah listened without judgment, understanding that David needed to process these experiences verbally. She had seen similar struggles in her work as a nurse, when medical professionals had to make life and death decisions under pressure. The weight of those decisions often didn't fully register until the immediate crisis had passed. The next morning brought Sarah's final day at Forward Operating Base Phoenix. Her return flight was scheduled for early afternoon, and the reality of leaving David behind again was becoming increasingly difficult to accept. The events of the past few days had intensified their connection, but they had also highlighted the vast differences between their daily realities. During their final breakfast together, Colonel Henderson approached their table with news that would change everything they had been planning for David's eventual return home. "David, I've received word from higher headquarters. Based on your performance during this deployment, and specifically your actions 2 days ago, you're being offered an opportunity to attend the Special Operations Target Interdiction course. It's a career-enhancing assignment that would extend your deployment by 4 months, but it would also set you up for rapid promotion and specialized assignments." The opportunity was clearly significant, and Sarah could see the conflict in David's eyes. Advanced training with special operations units was the kind of chance that could define a military career, but it would also mean more time apart and potentially more dangerous assignments in the future. "I need time to think about it," David said carefully, "and to discuss it with my wife." Henderson nodded understandingly. "Take all the time you need. The course doesn't start for 6 weeks, so you have time to decide." After Henderson left, Sarah and David walked around the base perimeter one final time, discussing the implications of the special operations opportunity. The choice represented more than just career advancement. It was a decision about what kind of life they wanted to build together and whether David's growing expertise as a sniper would become the central focus of his military service. "What do you want to do?" Sarah asked as they paused at the observation deck, where they had spent several evenings talking about their future. David stared out at the mountains that had become so familiar during his deployment. "Part of me wants the challenge. The work we do here matters, and I'm good at it. But another part of me just wants to come home to you and start the life we planned before all this began." Sarah understood the dilemma. She could see that David had found purpose and identity in his role as a precision marksman, and his success in saving lives during the recent engagement had reinforced his sense of calling. But she also knew that accepting the special operations assignment would likely lead to a career path that would keep them separated for years to come. "I won't make this decision for you," she said finally. "But whatever you choose, I'll support you. We'll find a way to make it work." When the time came for Sarah's departure, the entire experience felt surreal. She had arrived at the base as a military spouse trying to reconnect with her deployed husband. She was leaving as someone who had witnessed combat operations firsthand and had been forced to confront the realities of David's dangerous profession in ways she had never expected. The transport plane that would take her back to civilization was the same type of aircraft that had brought her to the base, but everything else had changed. She was no longer the somewhat naive military wife who had been excited about visiting her husband's deployment location. The events of the past week had educated her about the true costs of military service in ways that no briefing or conversation could have achieved. As the plane lifted off from Forward Operating Base Phoenix, Sarah pressed her face to the small window for one last glimpse of the base and the mountains beyond. She could see David standing with his teammates near the airfield, watching her departure. Even from a distance, she could sense the weight he was carrying and the difficult decisions he would have to make in the coming weeks. The flight home gave her time to process everything that had happened and to consider what their future might hold. David's offer to attend special operations training represented an opportunity for career advancement, but it also meant accepting a lifestyle built around extended separations and high-risk missions. The alternative, completing his current deployment and transitioning to a less specialized role might provide more stability, but could leave David feeling like he had abandoned his calling. By the time the plane landed in Colorado Springs, Sarah had reached a conclusion about David's career dilemma. She would encourage him to accept the special operations training, not because she wanted him to pursue increasingly dangerous assignments, but because she had seen firsthand the sense of purpose and accomplishment he derived from his work as a precision marksman. The shot that had saved the Afghan patrol had changed everything, not just the tactical situation in a remote valley, but David's understanding of his own capabilities and calling. Sarah realized that trying to pull him away from that sense of purpose would ultimately damage both his career and their relationship. Instead, she would find ways to support his professional development while building a marriage strong enough to withstand the challenges of military life. 3 weeks later, Sarah received a phone call from David. He had decided to accept the special operations training opportunity, but with a condition: after completing the course and one additional deployment, he would transition to a training role that would keep him stateside and allow them to start the family they had been planning. "The shot I took that day," David explained during their conversation, "it made me realize that I have a responsibility to use these skills as long as I can be effective. But it also reminded me that the reason I do this job is to protect the life we want to build together. For more months apart, then one more deployment, and then we can start the next chapter." Sarah agreed to the plan, understanding that David needed to fully explore his potential as a special operations soldier before he could be satisfied with a less demanding role. The visit to Forward Operating Base Phoenix had taught her that military families succeed not by avoiding the challenges of military life, but by facing those challenges together with honesty, communication, and mutual support. The Bronze Star ceremony took place 6 months later at Fort Carson, with Sarah in the audience watching as David received recognition for his actions during the engagement that had saved the Afghan patrol. As she watched her husband stand at attention while the citation was read, Sarah reflected on how much they had both changed since that unexpected week in Afghanistan. The young woman who had boarded a military transport plane with romantic notions about visiting her husband's deployment had been replaced by someone who understood the true costs and rewards of military service. The husband who had been struggling with the isolation and moral complexity of his role as a sniper had found peace with his calling and a path forward that honored both his professional obligations and personal commitments. The shot that changed everything had been fired in a moment of crisis, but its impact extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation. It had clarified David's understanding of his purpose, strengthened their marriage, and set them on a course that would allow them to build a life together while serving something larger than themselves. As they left the ceremony together, Sarah realized that the visit she had initially seen as a brief reunion had actually been the beginning of a new phase in their relationship, one built on a deeper understanding of sacrifice, purpose, and the ways that love can not only survive but strengthen in the face of extraordinary challenges.